Let me begin by thanking Vistula University for this invitation and for bringing me in the presence of my younger self here. It's always nice to be reminded you're getting older. And I'd like to thank Bartek for organizing everything that I've done here. I've been in Poland for 3.5 days, and it's convinced me that I was very foolish not to have been here before this trip, so I'm already planning to come back in 6 months. So I heard those boos in the back when I said this was the first trip, so I won't make that mistake again. I'm very privileged to be here with such a distinguished panel. Minister Olekowski was reminding me that we were on a commission together, chaired by Henry Kissinger and Larry Summers, back during, just after the Iraq War, the task of which was to put the transatlantic relationship back together again, and I think we succeeded in doing this, so that was good work. And Paula has been nice enough to come from London to talk on this subject. Thanks most of all to everybody in the audience for coming, the distinguished colleagues. I was once a policymaker and know how time-consuming it is, and that a state secretary should come and spend time on this, I really appreciate. And most of all, students. Of course, I teach for a living, and I know that you have many things to do other than come to this lecture, which is the kind of thing you do every day all the time. So I really appreciate that. Americans tend to lecture other people about what they should do a lot. I intend to be very brief in what I say. I'm going to discuss the way Europeans view Europe, because the way Europeans view Europe influences the way everybody else in the world views Europe, the way Americans view Europe, the way Chinese view Europe. And I want to argue that Europeans might choose to view Europe in a more pragmatic and more realistic way. Now, often when people say Europe should be viewed in a more pragmatic and realistic way, this is a code word for some kind of Euroscepticism, that one should be negative about European integration. I mean exactly the opposite. That in fact, if we view Europe in a pragmatic and realistic way, we'll actually be more positive about Europe. Because I think the general way that Europeans talk about the European Union and Europe generally rests on an ideology of European integration that was built up in the 1950s and basically never changed. An ideology of ever closer union, an ideology of formal centralized institutions, an ideology that argues that Europe needs to keep moving forward or it will fall apart. And this ideology leads them, oddly enough, to be kind of utopian pessimists, that they always want Europe to be moving forward, but they're always criticizing it now. So I intend to offer a much more optimistic view about where Europe is now. And although I'll be critical about certain things, it'll be very selective. And the spirit is meant to be pragmatic. Why pragmatic? Because Europe is a mature political institution. We often talk about the European Union as if it might collapse tomorrow. That if something happens to the euro or if people disagree about migration, the European Union could be gone like that. The European Union has been around longer than most established democracies in the world today. It's been around for over 60 years. It is built into the fabric of European life. You can't do business in Europe. You can't travel in Europe. You can't function legally in Europe. You can't do almost anything in Europe without confronting the European Union. It's here to stay. The question is only precisely what form should it take, and how should we talk about European identity? So let me make just 3 points about how Europeans have a kind of idealistic view of European integration, and how a more pragmatic view might give them a clearer, perhaps more accurate, and perhaps more optimistic view about where Europe is. So the first point, as I alluded to before, is that many Europeans, particularly those who are the strongest supporters of Europe, tend to be very critical about the current state of Europe. They tend to focus on crises, and they tend to stress why more integration is needed in order to solve the problems that we face. In its extreme form, this takes the form of the so-called bicycle theory. It's not really a theory, but the sort of bicycle conjecture that if Europe doesn't keep moving forward, it will collapse and you'll fall off the bicycle. Although I agree with almost everything that the State Secretary said, the tone of the speech is very much like this. Here are all the problems we have in Europe, and here are all the things we need to do. But let's just step back and talk for a minute about how successful this organization is. Right? This is by far the most successful voluntary international cooperation in world history over this 60-some-odd years. A customs union, the agricultural policy, a wide domain of regulatory norms for industry and economic activity that aren't just dominant in Europe. They're the dominant regulatory norms around the world. In China, the most important source of regulatory norms is Europe. Financial liberalization, the liberalization of border controls, coordination of home and internal affairs, anti-terrorist policies. Externally, you have a remarkable degree of coordination of foreign policy among European states. Most of the policies, almost all of the policies in the United Nations by European states are coordinated. And an enormous coordination of trade policy, development policy, other kinds of economic policy. Now, many people nowadays, faced with things like Ukraine or China or Russia, say, European foreign policy? You know, how can you view that as a success? Or the current state of the economy, how can you view that as a success? But let me just give 3 examples. Number 1, European enlargement. There is no single policy wielded by any country or organization anywhere in the world over the past 25 years that so cost-effectively spreads peace and prosperity as European enlargement. It is utterly unique. The United States has nothing like it. China has nothing like it. I don't need to tell people in Poland the effect of this policy. And it is still being used in places like the Western Balkans, and in an attenuated form, a smaller form, a thinner form, in neighborhood policy in places like Ukraine and Morocco. Second, free markets. We just went through the largest depression since the Great Depression, and there was almost no movement toward trade protection or even financial protection outside of a few countries throughout Europe. Compare that to the 1930s, where you had complete chaos and economic closure within Europe. That's an epochal shift. And finally, Ukraine. So a lot of people think, oh, Ukraine, well, how could that be a success? Consider what Europe has done, right? September 11th was the first day in 18 months when there was no artillery or mortar fire in Ukraine. Basically, we're moving toward a kind of or appear to be moving toward a kind of informal settlement, or not settlement, but informal compromise in Ukraine. And that compromise is almost entirely based on the exercise of European economic power. Americans had almost nothing to do with it. NATO showed up, flew a few airplanes around, but the power exercised against Russia is the power exercised by European sanctions and the disapproval of Europeans. Europeans trade with Russia 12 times more than the United States. They trade with everybody more than the United States, more with China, more with almost everybody. And it is Europe that is on the front line of this battle, and it is Europe that is prevailing. Mr. Putin can't project power more than a couple of hundred miles off his own border. And Europe has blocked him without ever shooting off a gun. As I said, Europeans tend not to stress these things as successes for the European Union. Instead, they're often portrayed as crises or failures, as areas where Europe needs to do more. They're often presented as areas where Europe is in a crisis and there should be more formal cooperation in Europe. And this is a distinctly European way of speaking about the problem. When Americans do something, even something that's clearly a failure, like the war in Iraq, they go and boast that it's a big success, right? When the Chinese do something that's a total failure, like building a couple of platforms on islands in the South China Sea, they say, look at what we're doing, right? When the Europeans do something, like standing down Mr. Putin in Ukraine, they go, this policy doesn't seem to be working. We're really not sure. What should we do? It's a crisis. And send up a state secretary to talk about it, right? This is not helpful. Not just because it leads European citizens not to have confidence in their own institutions, but because it leads people in Washington and Beijing to wonder, like, what's the matter with these people, right? If you want Americans and Chinese to respect you, tell them that you're powerful, okay? That's number one. Number two, Europeans tend to be legal formalists. Okay, they tend to think that Europe is successful when it works as a legally integrated institution, and that the only way to solve collective problems is by working formally through institutions. Of course, most people who favor European integration, if you ask them, will deny that they believe in a United States of Europe or ever closer union because it's politically incorrect to admit that. It's just that they've never seen a proposal for formal centralization that they didn't approve of, right? They approve of them all. But in fact, often cooperation in the European Union works better if it is not formally centralized. It works better when Europeans used informal coalitions of the willing. In fact, even the formal institutions of the European Union, as I'm sure the students here have learned in their classes and the practitioners here know from their experience, don't actually work in the way that the formal rules say they should work. European institutions say that there should be qualified majority voting, but there's almost never qualified majority voting. It's usually consensual bargaining of some slippery and complicated, quiet variety. And this is particularly true in an area like foreign policy. So let's take another example, Libya. So you might think intervening in Libya was a wise thing in the long term for Europeans to do. You might think it wasn't a wise thing. But it was something Europeans did want to do. And the Americans didn't want to do it. We weren't interested in intervening in Libya. So Europeans got together and talked about it. And what they found was some countries wanted to intervene in Libya and some didn't. So the countries that did want to intervene in Libya, Britain and France, but not Germany, etc., got together. They convinced the United States to do it. They organized the operation. It cost no more than €1 billion compared to almost $1 trillion that the United States has spent in Iraq and failed. And they got the job done. Almost every headline in European papers said, what a failure for European integration. Because the European governments didn't agree, because the Germans didn't come along, where was the European Council in this discussion? Why don't we have stronger European security cooperation? Is so difficult, right? But you should judge European integration not by the formal perfection of the legal institutions, but by what you get done. Again, this is the way the Americans and the Chinese think about it, right? It's what you get done in the world. Or if you want to put it in moral terms, how many lives you save on the ground in Libya. That's what matters, not whether or not the council signed off on it. And this is a very EU way of thinking about it. And it's unhelpful, both inside of Europe and outside of Europe. And there are many examples one could cite where this kind of flexible cooperation actually works better. Europeans should not be afraid of it. Third example, many Europeans believe that questioning any European policy is to question all of the European project. But remember where we started. European integration has been around for 65 years. It's permanent. It's not going to go anywhere. When polities, when states become established, the debate is no longer, will there be a Poland, or will there be a United States, or will there be an EU? The debate is this a good policy or not? And if not, you get rid of it. Now, the EU has some policies that are not so good as they should be. Now, here's where I'll discuss the kind of things that the State Secretary was talking about, the kind of current crises. So let's look at the EU policies right now. The Ukraine, actually I think that policy is pretty good and it's working pretty well. We have the problem with Britain, British exit. I think the probability of British exit is 0. 0. I mean, it would be crazy for the British to exit. We're viewing the amusing spectacle of the Conservative Party in Britain, the quasi-Eurosceptical party, arguing for staying in the European Union, backed by the left-wing party. And even if there were a vote to pull out, then the likely outcome would be to twiddle around with the treaties a little bit and then to ask them to do what the Irish did when they voted against the last treaty amendment. They vote again until they get it right. That's what you always do. And the idea that a pro-business, right-wing British party would pull out of the European Union is, in my view, absurd, and I refuse to think about it. Migration. Migration is a serious issue. It's obvious, just looking at the Polish debate, that this creates real domestic political problems for people in different polities. But I'm not sure that it creates an existential issue for the European Union, because the European Union can survive with different countries having different tolerances for accepting immigrants. The policy I worry about is the euro. Because the euro is basically a bad policy. What do I mean by a bad policy? It's a policy of imposing a single macroeconomic standard on an entire group of countries which do not have the same macroeconomic fundamentals. Economists agree that this is not a good idea, and it is something that imposes intense costs on particular countries, particularly on weaker or deader economies. This is not a particular economic view. It's everybody's economic view, right? It's the conventional wisdom in economics. We know that once you take away the option to devalue and the option to use an independent monetary policy, the only option left for countries in the south of Europe now is internal deflation, and that many countries, I think most notably Italy, are structurally uncompetitive within this system. So to remain within the euro without forcing policy adjustment on surplus countries or finding a way for it to take place in a less costly form for debtor countries is to simply impose low growth on Europe in perpetuity. And imposing low growth on Europe in perpetuity is a bad idea, not just because growth is the source of all the other good things that society can do, and not just because it creates political weakness and conflict in societies. It's a bad thing because it undermines support for European integration. Look at poll support for European integration over time. For 40 years, continuously, European institutions were more trusted, better liked than national political institutions in almost every state of the European Union. That stopped at one moment, 2008, 2009. Poll support for the European Union, the number of people who think they trust European institutions went down from 50% to 10 or 12 or 15%. So sticking with the euro isn't the European policy, it's the policy that undermines Europe. But what stops Europeans from criticizing it? It's this belief that if you criticize just one European policy, the whole edifice will come tumbling down. And that's the idea from the 1950s that Europeans need to get rid of. In Poland, or the United States, or Germany, if one policy is bad, you criticize the policy, you're not calling into question the country. Very different in Europe. So overall, in conclusion, Europe would be a healthier place, a more legitimate place in the eyes of its own citizens, and an easier place to explain to people outside of Europe, in America, in China, and the rest of the world, if its justification, its public justification, were pragmatic and realistic rather than idealistic. If people didn't always say we needed more integration and everything about Europe was in crisis, if people weren't always focusing on legally formalistic solutions to problems, and if they didn't always defend policies, even if they're clearly bad policies. I gave this summary of these remarks to European ambassadors this morning, and they all disagreed with me. And I'm sure you will too. So thank you very much.